I think it's very easy to sense that the essence of democracy in this chamber perhaps may be more fragile than I thought. I must give pause for concern. And I would counsel all here to search their consciences.
The Honourable Brian Walker.
Thank you, President. I have to say that listening to this motion today, I can very well appreciate the truth of what has been said. We are indubitably in a crisis. It's clear, it is present. The way I see things progressing in the current situation today is the problem of looking at a problem and the superficial fixes for that, whereas the underlying causes are often not addressed because they may be too difficult to address. The trouble is, if you don't address the underlying causes, the problem persists. There may be a slight shift here, but the problem basically persists. It will continue. And as illustrated by my colleague here, the Honourable Dr. Brad Pettit, we actually have a major problem in all aspects of society with status quo thinking. Status quo thinking will do more of what we've done in the past and hope we get a different outcome. This is human, I think. We tend to do this. We tend not to think in new ways because they may be dangerous, they may fail. We don't want to fail. And that really is a problem for every single one of us. We need, in all aspects of our society, we need to adopt the principle that thinking new thoughts, thinking outside the box, is the only way out of repeating the errors of the past. Now, if you look here at what the underlying causes are, we certainly say that one problem is that we have a supply shortage. We don't have enough houses, of course. And we look at the rental situation. Is it 0.4% free rentals? 0.4%, which is ridiculously small. We've also got, with that, the population growth, which will be asking for houses to buy or indeed places to rent. On top of that, we've got the economic factors. We have wage stagnation just now. We only look at what our public service workers are asking for. They're asking for income which would allow them to pay their rent rather than working two jobs to be able to afford to live. And then, of course, we have the investment trends, which we have no control over that, really, do we? Because as a government, we can't control how investments are carried out. But real estate as an attractive investment, we spoke about this just a few weeks ago, did we not? About how difficult it is to actually control how we manage who buys a house and what we do with that house, especially if you can get a higher return for the house by using the short-term Airbnb. Then we come to the government policies, which I'll speak about in a short moment. How can a government actually manage this? And the last one, of course, is beyond us at state level. It's the interest rates and financing, things which in our society are actually contributing to the difficulty in providing the houses. So let me now turn, if you like, and I'm just going to give a short contribution because I'm not going to criticise anyone, because really what we're looking at here is a situation which needs to be dealt with, not a situation where we can apportion blame. We need to find a solution. And this is actually an idea, a solution-oriented discussion as to how can we alleviate the problems in our society. And speaking here as a Member of Parliament, we ought to be looking at what can government do. And the first thing that would come up with that, of course, is the recognition we need careful planning. Now, my experience of government planning is actually a case study in how to go slowly. And that being held in the forefront of our minds, the next question is going to be funding. And all of the ideas I'm going to give you will require funding. And that, of course, begs the question, with the budget coming up in a very short time, is how do we apportion the available resources to manage the housing crisis? And on top of that, we've got the coordination. And again, if we look at what government is doing, I find it very remarkable that any two parts of government can speak to each other, and coordination then between the different government departments is a dubious beast at best and completely misconceived at worst. So these are things which we need to address at a governmental level. But let us go now into some of the things which we could be doing. And I have to throw this together because it's come at me rather suddenly, although I've been thinking about this personally for some time, as I am actually personally in the process of looking for housing for myself and family. So this is here of importance for my own personal well-being. Now, one of the things that we could do is increase housing supply. Of course, I'm saying stupid things. Of course, we need to increase housing supply. How would we go about doing that? We heard just now about how local governments there are unable to grant more than 3 months for housing in, say, a caravan, and that we need ministerial approval for up to 12 months. Why up to 12 months? If there's a paddock free and there's a caravan on that, why do we have to limit the ability to stay in a caravan on a paddock? This is bureaucratic red tape, and it does not belong in the discussion. It goes even further. I would be putting out the call that we embrace tiny houses. I don't know what anyone else here is doing, but I'm so engaged in working in Parliament and also in medical practice that for me a bedroom doesn't have to be much bigger than a bed itself. For the little time I spend in there. And as for an expansive living area, personally speaking, I don't need that. If I've got a door into the backyard with a bit of cover, I'm perfectly happy. Other people may want an expansive mansion, 5 bedrooms, a swimming pool. I don't know. That's for them, perhaps. I don't know how they would live there. But certainly tiny housing is something that I and many others would welcome as a reasonable and cost-effective approach to managing the housing crisis. Now, I wouldn't use a backyard for cannabis. I'd use actually a grow tent. But there we are. Now, another one here could be incentives for developers. Now, these could include things like offering tax incentives, subsidies or reduced fees that developers are needing to actually have some incentive, especially in this climate, for actually building. I was speaking recently with as a home builders action group, outlining the severe problems they've had in the last couple of years ever since COVID. This was the background for some of the questions I've been asking at Questions Without Notice, because they have put very clearly the cogent case that their current financial difficulties and ability to survive has been adversely affected by the grants that were given to boost the building and a well-intended approach to solving the issues with people coming back during COVID, not having a place to live. And that has had follow-on effects when the ability to actually charge for the increased costs was not passed on to the builder, and therefore bankruptcies ensued. Something which really we ought to address at a governmental level with offering reasonable and suitable resources to allow these builders to actually find some way of tiding themselves over the crisis. Imagine, if you will, the example of someone who is on hard times, needs a loan from the bank to get over that while they find new employment, a new place to live, and can then begin to contribute back, having the finances available to repay the debt they owe to the government. That would, in fact, be an excellent idea. Another area where we could work actually with is increasing housing supplies in the public housing projects. Now, I was very distressed to hear, very distressed indeed, to hear that with a smaller population in Tasmania, they spent more on public housing than WA. And to hear from the government how well they have been actually providing public housing, you look at the actual figures and compare them, you see, well, there's a mismatch there. Yes, we're making it sound good for the benefit of people who think the government isn't doing enough. But the fact of the matter is we're spending less than Tasmania for public housing projects, and that simply is not acceptable, especially with a reasonable budget surplus, which might be used to better advantage elsewhere. Another area we could be working is actually improving affordability. The financial assistance programmes, expanding grants or subsidies, low-interest loan programmes for first-time home buyers. They could make housing more accessible, especially to first home buyers. Nowadays, we're hearing that young people today are unable to afford even the deposit for the houses, and the cost of housing in Perth is projected to increase 20%, or was it 30%, in this coming couple of years. This must put the fear of God into anyone who is contemplating buying a home but hasn't yet got the funds together for the first deposit. We could look, as we have done recently, at rent control and stabilisation, and do more, perhaps, to implementing or enhancing rent control policies. And I think reasonable steps have been taken, but perhaps more could be done. We ought to explore this. Bear in mind, colleagues, what I'm looking at here is not criticising, but offering suggestions, solutions that might assist us in the move towards helping with the housing situation. And tax policies, adjusting property taxes. I've failed to see the purpose behind a capital gains tax or taxing a stamp duty on a house. I see why the government may need the money, but do you know, so much money spent on just stamp duty when you're buying a house is a huge imposition in these times of financial constraint. Regulatory reforms, another area we could look at. Building regulations. We could simplify the building code. Now, that does not mean we make things less safe. It does not mean we have standards which are lower. It simply means cutting the unnecessary red tape. And I challenge anyone to tell me with a believable straight face that government does not multiply red tape. We've talked about in the past the foreign investment rules, tightening regulations on which foreign investments in residential real estate can impact upon our economy. And bearing in mind that I am very well used to the concept of foreign relations and living in other countries, I do support the idea of keeping Australia safe and protecting it from external interference from foreign investment. We might welcome the incoming investment, but it does have a knock-on when it affects the ability of residents here to live in peace and comfort. We have the question of economic and labour policies. There could be support for the key industries. In the building trades, there is actually this sense here that they are being left behind and unable to actually make their future. So the tradies now are finding themselves unable to survive here, moving off to the mines where they can earn better money, leaving the housing development here very difficult to staff, and the costs thereby will increase. We could talk about education and training. How could we, through better education, how could we then achieve a population which is better able to cope with these issues, better able financially to manage, such that they might be able to manage their own situations to then allow affordability to make them benefit from the richness that is, in fact, part of our life. Australia is a very rich country, and we ought to be blessed, we feel blessed to live here. The question here about urban planning and infrastructure. I am not going to go into here about the need for increased tree canopy. That is so blindingly obvious that we can make our cities much more livable if we simply allowed the temperature to come down by increasing the trees, by increasing vegetation. Even Shanghai, for example, has a 30% policy of greening their city. That's not something we have here. And if you look at the new developments here, where the trees are shut down and the houses spring up in a barren desert of mortars, concrete, bricks, hardly a living thing in sight. And that makes it very difficult to live in comfort there. But things like infrastructure, we have the trains. I know you've been focusing on the Metronet, and a good thing too, but can we then look at public transport between the various rails? How do we manage our road access to places which make places more livable, more attractive to find, and indeed to develop? And of course, the last one, which the governments do like to have, is monitoring and data collection. This last legislation we passed through was apparently all to do with collecting data on houses, such that we can then decide about small rentals, small holiday homes, bed and breakfast, to understand what needs to be, what is available, such that we can then find a better way of using the available resources. So the government actions, they can be potentially very significant. And I would encourage all members here, both those in government and those who are yet to come into government, to look at this with an open mind, finding solutions. And I would suggest the best approach is finding solutions in a bipartisan manner, not to gain points one side or the other, but to work for the common good of the people. And I would beg that this attitude be taken into Parliament today and tomorrow.
Does say it's very counterintuitive, but the amendment is appropriate. The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
Thank you, Acting President. The point I would make is that it's quite clearly not a direct negative, it's very much an indirect negative. And so what we now have is a motion which completely opposes the original motion and is, because you have only one chance for a motion in the entire year, to take that motion and reverse it into its opposite meaning, although it's indirect. The effect is still the same, and that, I would think, is a disgraceful state of affairs. Now, the members know me as being a reasonable person. The members know that I will generally be supportive of good communication. And I would put it to the chamber and to the consciences of everyone in this chamber that the motion that we have before us now, the amendment we have before us now, is a slap in the face of democracy. It is not to be tolerated. It is a disgrace on this place and the disgrace of every single member who supports the action which brought this out.
Order. Members. The Honourable Dr Brian Walker has the call.
And I appreciate this is very hard to understand in this partisan state of affairs, but...
Members. The Honourable Dr Brian Walker has the call.
But this motion as it stands...
Members.
I think it's very easy to sense that the essence of democracy in this chamber perhaps may be more fragile than I thought. I must give pause for concern. And I would counsel all here to search their consciences. While this may have been a correct amendment to the letter of the standing orders, it certainly was not a correct amendment when it comes to dealing with fairness and justice in the democracy. I oppose it.